Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership between the Institute for Advanced Study, Northrop, and the University Honors Program to present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year about timely topics of interest. This six-part 2021 series will focus on polarization and identities, inspired both by the 2020 presidential election and the polarization that has appeared in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In an academic year that includes an election and in an environment in which conversations across different identities and ideologies are becoming increasingly contentious, we hope to model ways to create meaningful dialogue about these difficult but important topics for our students and community. We will have an opportunity at the end of today's conversation for questions, and we invite those in the audience to ask those questions live. Those of you who are participating on Zoom can enter your questions into the Q&A function on your Zoom menu bar. While I wait for the land acknowledgement to come back up, I will just say how glad we are to have you here with us both in person and on Zoom. The University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. It is my pleasure now to introduce today's panelists, Gaby Cook and LaTasha Barnes. Gaby Cook is a veteran Lindy Hopper of all stripes. For the last 15 years, she has been an active professional in the global Lindy Hop scene, teaching and performing for events such as Harangue Dance Camp, Lindy Focus, Paris Jazz Roots, and Stompology, among others. Currently, she is artistic director for two New York-based dance companies based in the language of swing and vernacular jazz, Wild Rhythm Dance Company and Gatsby Entertainment. These two companies have presented feature performances on stages like Jacob's Pillow Inside Out series, Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, 92nd Street Y, Midsummer Night's Swing at Lincoln Center, The Great Gatsby Party, and many appearances at the Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center. Wild Rhythm is a current dance company in residence at Brooklyn College through the City University of New York Dance Initiative program. In the classroom, she is playful, informative, and honest. Through teaching dance, she seeks to connect new audiences to the immensely rich history of swing-era dances. She prioritizes equality for followers and leaders in the classroom space and has championed a movement-first approach to teaching partnered dance content. LaTasha Barnes is an internationally recognized and awarded dancer, educator, coach, tradition bearer, and cultural ambassador. Based in New York, Barnes is globally celebrated for her musicality, athleticism, and joyful presence throughout the cultural traditions she bears: house, hip-hop, whacking, vernacular jazz, and Lindy Hop. Her expansive artistic, competitive, and performative skills have made her a frequent collaborator to Dorrance Dance, Singapore-based Timber Arts Group, Efrat Asheri Dance, and her leadership skills have placed her in positions of service as chair of the Board of Trustees for Ladies of Hip Hop Festival, board member for Black Lindy Hoppers Fund and Frankie Manning Foundation, and contributing member to NEFER Global Movement Collective. Expanding the scope of impact for her communities, Barnes completed her self-designed master's in ethnochoreology, Black Studies, and Performance Studies through New York University's Gallatin School in 2019. Her thesis and continuing research are working to bridge the gap between communities of practice and academic cultural dance research, performance, preservation, and pedagogy. In concert with these efforts, she is honored to be a part of the Brain Trust developing the groundbreaking stage production Swing Out, bringing the passion and power of Lindy Hop and its community to the concert stage. Accolades and goals aside, Barnes's forever purpose is to inspire fellow artists and arts enthusiasts to cultivate an authentic sense of self and purpose in their creative expressions and daily lives. Let's take a look at a short video about their project Swing Out, and then I will introduce our moderator. Thanks for your patience with technology issues. Of course, everything was working perfectly when we checked it before the webinar, so maybe we'll watch the video again at the end so you get a chance to hear all of the music. Now it's my pleasure to introduce John Rash, an editorial writer and columnist. His Rash Report column analyzes media and politics, and his focus on foreign policy has taken him on international reporting trips to China, Japan, South Korea, Rwanda, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Lithuania, Kuwait, and Canada. John's commentary can be heard on WCCO AM on Friday mornings at 8:10 a.m. and on Wednesdays on Playing Politics, a podcast from the editorial board. He lives in St. Louis Park with his wife, 2 children, and a dog. I'll turn it over now to you, John. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome and the generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And The first thing I'll do is I'll acknowledge that nothing I say will come as close to being as entertaining or as enthusiastic as that performance that you just saw. And even without the complete audio, you could get a sense of it. I think more than anything, it's just such a welcome respite and reminder to see people not having to social distance and indeed, being close and interacting. And let's hope we certainly get back to an environment like that as quickly as possible. So with all that being said, if again, it won't be as, what I say as entertaining or as enlightening. Certainly our guests will be, but of course a moderator cannot be a wallflower. So I'm just going to jump into the discussion. I want to welcome all of you here who are taking part on campus or online. As mentioned before, we look forward to your participation in the conversation. We'll have plenty of time for questions. So those who are here at Northrop Auditorium and those who are taking part via Zoom, jump into the chat, and I think you'll find that both of our guests today will really entertain and your questions, and look forward to taking part in that dialogue. As mentioned, this is part of a 6-part series. A fortnight ago was mostly focused on polarization and how to bridge the red-blue divide that's convulsing the country. Today, we'll focus more on identities, but also discuss how forming them or re-popularizing them can be polarizing for some as well. Identities are multidimensional, of course, and no one art form defines an identity, but it can contribute to them. And a dance as vibrant and as alive as we just saw up there as the Lindy Hop reflects something unique about an identity, as does the more modern day interpretations of it. But first, let's define it, the Lindy Hop, what it is, perhaps what it isn't, and what does the modern Lindy Hop community look like. And I thought I'd love to hear from both of you, and we'll start with you, LaTasha, in terms of if you want to jump into that conversation, and then we'll get to Gabby Cook as well and hear her. But why don't you explain for all of us, what this dance is, what the origin of it was, and how it's reflected in our modern culture as well.
Thanks for that, John. Wow. 1-2 punch right off the gate. That's great. I'm actually going to borrow from my great friend Nathan Bew, Gabby's husband, and just succinctly say that the Lindy Hop looks like this. It is an embodiment. It's an expression. And we have lots of codified ways of articulating the shapes that we see, that we familiarize with the style or the form of Lindy Hop. But it is a Black American dance form that is meant to encapsulate your story. And as such, as it's continuing to move across the globe, it is in many ways still doing this. It is inherent within that, but it is a wonderful expression meant to give you space to live and tell your truth to big band music, to jazz music. That is going to be the succinct version of that answer. And I'll let Gabby embellish further.
Yeah, and that's the right way to start, is what it feels like and what the message of the dance is. To attack it from another angle, Lenny Hop is a social dance improvisational art form that developed in the late 20s and 30s and 40s in New York, specifically in Harlem, New York's famous Black neighborhood, originator of so much Black culture. It came about at the Savoy Ballroom, which is a specific ballroom on the east side of Harlem at Lenox and 141st to 142nd. It arose in the context of other social dance forms. So at that time in this country, in New York, but also globally, social dance was a much bigger part of just the social fabric of how people would entertain themselves and spend their time. Of course, recorded music was not as figured out as it is today. So the main way of listening to music was to see bands. Of course, there were bands playing at the Savoy Ballroom, and the music style that happened to be playing at that time was jazz. And the particular iteration of jazz was big band swing. And that we might characterize as large arrangements of horn players, rhythm instruments, belonging to what you might imagine swing jazz music sounds like. So it is the social dance form that grew alongside this trend in popular music. As I said, it comes from New York, it comes from a specific time and a specific place, but it also grew in popularity. The dancers in New York and the musicians, of course, in New York spread its popularity across the country, namely through movies. And from there, it became a global phenomena, not only in the US, but worldwide as soldiers after World War II would bring the dancing that was native to them and the way they like to dance to global communities that they were in. Currently, the swing dance community remains to be a global phenomena. There are social dance scenes in all major cities in the US, and it's a great time.
Well, thank you very much for sharing some of the past and certainly some of the present. I want to get back to a few of the things that you mentioned, but first I want to come back to you, LaTasha, and you used the word encapsulate your story. And I want to know if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, please. Specifically, how do you get to the origination story of understanding, what was intended, how it was put together, and what the original is? And to what degree do you look at it as it's also open to modern day interpretation?
That's a very thoughtful question. Thank you. One of the things, as Gabby pointed out, is that this was about the daily lived expressions of, or the lived experiences of the African American community that was in Harlem. And though we go by a lot of these timestamps, name stamps, in order to understand art forms, we really do a disservice to them when we don't regard the fact that this timestamp, this date stamp, this name stamp was a moment meant to identify something that was already happening and coalescing at that particular point in time. So the main thing for us, particularly from an anthropological standpoint, that we look to are the way that the people were living, the way that they were expressing themselves among each other, the places that they came from, even prior to that moment of an artistic expression being named. And a lot of this was from the migrations from New Orleans upward into New York. A lot of the immigrants that came through from the islands that came through to New York as well, all over this northern migration that happened, and how people came together to celebrate, to share who they were. And this is, for me personally, and I know for a lot of educators as well, the crux of how we hope the movement, the dance form, can translate to modern day, because it is meant to be your expression. You should be connected to how you're living your life daily, so that when you get space to move about it, this is a form that you can use to express that. And it's challenging to get some people into the mindset of actually being honest with themselves, where they are in their bodies and in their daily lives, to actually allow that to live in the movement. But that is one of the most beautiful things about the Lindy Hop, the power, the passion of it. I know we keep saying those words, but those are the two words that are, I personally would say, closest to the robustness of this art form that you see when it hits you. And for those who celebrate and love Lindy Hop, they know exactly what I mean by that phrase, when it hits you. When you're seeing a group of people swinging out at you, I don't know how, but that energy just washes over you. And it does feel joyful, but one of the things that we have to regard is that it feels joyful for a reason that may not be joyful. And it is meant to celebrate and share all that people are. And our hope is that as it continues to move throughout the world, that people will pay attention to that and be responsible to that, to make sure that it continues to stay as robust as it should be, not just a performative thing that looks nice.
Gabby, you referenced, some of the origin in terms of back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So you're talking 190, 80 years ago. And I'm curious, as you and LaTasha and others, have looked at this not just in terms of dance, but academically. You're both educators in this movement as well. Were you able to turn to elders in the community, people who lived through the origin story of this, who can explain what it meant to them and also explain how it may have looked like and how that may indeed have changed.
Well, I'm happy to give a brief answer, but I think that LaTasha in her ethnochoreology research has done a lot of one-on-one interviews with the originators of this dance, and I think she's far more suited to answer it, which is why I'll just get in this brief answer. I have attended as a student dance camps that featured the creators of this dance form, namely Frankie Manning, Norma Miller, also Frankie Manning's son, Chaz Young, who is part of the continuation of the dance form and obviously has great insight on the dance because of his family. Being at events where the dancers who created the form, for whom this is not a style, but simply a native way of speaking and moving and entertaining, the impact that leaves on me is remembering that they're not just steps. They're events that happen in people's lives, and they happen to be crystallized in amber and handed to me as 1, 2, 3, and 4, or whatever it is, rock step, triple step. But they really are living human ideas encapsulated in movement. And as time passes on, as we get further away and from those elders, and as we have more and more students coming into the dance without that first that contact with those individuals, it's more and more important that those who choose to teach the dance remind the students that this isn't a dance about steps, it's a dance about people. But I would like to defer to LaTasha, who's done much more in-depth interviewing and research on the subject.
LaTasha?
I appreciate that, Gabby. But one of the things that you will come to find, my research has been about their experiences, not just about, as we were saying, the regurgitatable facts. And as Gabby very beautifully said, yeah, that's really the point. It's about their lives. It's actually meant to tell the story. Like Sugar Sullivan's swing outs, or twists, excuse me, as she likes to call them, won't look the same as Norma Miller's. And for those who've actually tried those embodiments, like, the variations are very, very challenging if you're not present within yourself. One of the things that Gabby just alluded to that's very personal to me, as we see the dance move more throughout the world, one of the challenges really is having dancers, potential dancers, recognize themselves and actually take a minute to sit with themselves and understand how they would like to express themselves within this different language. I know we say often in classroom settings, this is a language. And when you're learning any language, you learn the basics. Hi, goodbye, thank you, please, where's the bathroom? But you don't exist in that language only asking or saying those same things over and over. And even in saying those things, in certain areas, you learn different dialects, ways of asking for those things, saying thank you, or dismissing yourself, what have you. And so really taking time to sit with the context that these amazing artists, of course, back then, maybe they didn't consider themselves artists until they won a thing or were paid for a thing, but to really take time to hear between the facts of their story, to actually understand who they were as people, gives us some insight and space into how we can possibly continue to use this language to allow ourselves to speak as the dance form moves forward. That's the most critical thing to me personally, that acknowledgement of who they were as people.
And if what we're saying to you, John, or to our audience feels a little abstract and in specific, the dance associated, the individual dance associated with Lenny Hop is something in the modern community we call solo jazz. We also might call it vernacular jazz. It's just dancing to jazz music. This has very little in common with a studio dance form. All this to say that when we teach, choreograph, perform these steps, they all have names. And the names are things that are specific to that lived experience. A sugar step is something that a student might hear in a vernacular jazz class or even a contemporary jazz class. And that step is named after the dancer Sugar Sullivan. There's a step called Tack and Annie, which through the lore of Lindy Hop history, I had been told is about police brutality, which is about a chorus girl named Annie who's being tacked with her arms behind her back by police. And it's a step where the arms are actually making this shape. So the names of steps have meanings and stories behind them. Some of them are more contemporary, very few of them. For example, there's a step called the Eagle Slide, which was named more recently, alluding to Eddie the Eagle, because there's a low rise, a lowness to a rise, and that relates to the skier in the British Olympics in the 80s. I'm not too up to speed on my Olympic history, but nonetheless, the point is the steps relate to people and stories. They're not just clinical names that are just given for ease of commodification.
Well, that's a great cultural reference of Eddie the Eagle. And for particularly the younger people here who may not be familiar, Eddie was a Brit who had a dream of being a ski jumper. And so when you think of ski jumpers, generally you think of Scandinavia and the flying Finns and the great gold medalists out of Japan as well. And he looked like me or everyday guy who went and he learned how to ski jump, and he became a media sensation in the 1980s at the Calgary Olympics. And, you know, it was kind of a reinterpretation of that sport that made it more accessible to people. And I thought that I would reference another reinterpretation, a little bit more specific to the Lindy Hop. And we're going to cue up here in just a moment a commercial that both of you will be very familiar with, and perhaps the younger people here have seen it. If not, your parents or grandparents saw it. It's an ad from 1998 from the Gap, and if and when we have that to run, we can watch it, and then I certainly want to hear from both LaTasha and Gabby. That ad sold a lot of khakis in 1998, and yet when you look at it, it's about as monochromatic as the pants themselves, and seems very, very far from the roots of the movement. And I'll start with you, LaTasha. When you review that ad, and I know that's one that I'm sure you've seen and have some, you know, perspective both as a dancer and also as an academic. You know, when you see that, how influential was that? Was that a positive, negative, or neutral dynamic, you know, for the movement that you're so involved in, and what kind of impact did that have?
Wow, sorry. I'm gonna have to take a few seconds to compose myself because I was not prepared for your monochromatic joke. That was that was spot on, John. Yeah, we give you kudos for that one. That was really good.
Thank you.
Um, so I think we chatted about this a little bit. The challenge of, I guess we would say, the globalization of art forms is always complex, more complex than people want to acknowledge often. There's that word again, acknowledgement. For me personally, I was graduating high school when that ad came out. Whew. And I would say that inherently, it's not a good or bad thing, but the things that happened as a result of this have been challenging in multiple ways. First, for a generation such as myself, I'm 40, seeing that ad only further ascribed the notion that swing was a thing that white people did, not that it was of the Black experience or a representation of Blackness, which is very upending in that particular stage of identity forming when you're coming from high school and starting to step into quote unquote adulthood and trying to find a way and understand not just how the world sees you, but how you can see yourself. For many people think that you can see yourself as anything, but as many people are coming aware of or becoming more aware of, that even though said was not always the case for African Americans. So to have something as prolific as jazz and Lindy Hop be represented as something other than the absolutely explosive organic source for all of this amazing art that we still celebrate in modern times, be represented as something that it was not, is very disheartening and disappointing, to say the least. And what was one of the good things for me that happened from that was, number one, seeing white people dance, because I hadn't actually really seen much of that where I grew up. There were a few, but not many. And recognizing that there were some intersectable points about celebration that could be shared. So that was what I took from it then. And now we have an entire community, or as Gabby has helped me to understand, like, and articulate, an entire economy that's based off of people's experience from seeing that ad and wanting to be a part of that experience. So yeah, neither good nor bad, but many things have happened as a result of that.
Thank you. And what's your perspective, Gabby, on, the ad in particular, what it perhaps triggered, but from a broader perspective, the different interpretations and what this means to a cultural movement, such as.
Okay. I would also, yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question how we deal with mass culture that has a specific origin, but is supposed to be for everyone. And everything that happens after that. It's obviously not unique to Lindy Hop. There, of course, is a very, a very recognizable pattern of the theft of artistic artifacts coming from marginalized communities, finding their way into the mainstream, and then being capitalized upon by those in power. In this particular iteration, of course, it's the theft of something that originates in the Black community, but wasn't necessarily only for Black people. The Savoy was a dance hall attended by white attendees, and even though it really is a danced originally by African American performers, none of the white early performers at the Savoy showed up in the public performances with that original group of dancers. That doesn't mean that there was an exclusionary statement from the get-go. That said, we've got this sort of secondary dynamic when it becomes popular and commercialized, and questions come into the fray, like, how can we maximize this moment? How can we maximize this product? And the answer, time and time again in Lindy Hop and for other art forms, is, well, let's sell it to a white audience with a white or appealing to white audience performers. And then you end up with maybe an ad that looks like this. So that's kind of a wordy introduction to my thoughts and feelings about it. I started dancing in 2004, which isn't long after this video aired. And this video was part of a larger cultural moment that we in the swing community called neo swing, which is to say, sometime in the 90s, different cultural impacts, including the rise of ska music, the repopularization of big band swing orchestras like the Brian Setzer Orchestra, the Cherry Poppin' Daddies, Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, other bands that don't all end in the word daddy, and the popularization of a sort of 1960s aesthetic that now we might associate with Mad Men, slinky pencil skirts and martinis and bowling shirts emblazoned with dice on fire. If anyone was around, you know. If you don't, then it sounds really ridiculous. Anyways, all these things, these three cultural forces came together: the popularity of swing music, the popularity of ska music, and this sort of 60s thing, which had the word swing in it. And together they braided and created this thing that neo swing is the title of. It did get swing into a lot of people's lives. It did popularize swing dancing. And some of those people that saw this ad and were, you know, impacted by those cultural trends came to swing dance classes and dug deeper. They dug into the history of the dance. They got involved. They learned more than one or two steps. They learned to respect the challenges that the dance offers, and also the vast artistic rewards that it has. So I don't know. Ultimately, I agree with LaTasha. I'm a little ambivalent about it. To give it a negative charge, it feels like giving a negative charge to like a environmental disaster. Is it a bad thing that Lenny Hop has been repainted as like a white cultural invention? Yes. But is that a thing that just happens in the intertwining of capitalism and folk art? Yeah, of course. And what's the remedy of that? Deeper conversations like the one that we're having today, curious audiences, associating the artistic platform to the communities who created them, rather than just getting the last iteration that happened to come your way.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I want to, that brings up several lines of thought. I'll turn to you, LaTasha, and then back to you, Gabby. But Gabby just spoke about deepening the conversation and how this process, often called cultural appropriation in today's parlance, happens to other art forms as well. And one immediate example that jumps to mind from this year was a bestseller called American Dirt, which was ostensibly about a Hispanic housekeeper, and a novelization that to some degree tried to speak to the broader issue of the immigration experience. And it became quite controversial because it sold so well, and it was written by a white woman who didn't have any kind of direct experience, and in a way was speaking in the voice of this housekeeper. And LaTasha, I'll turn to you first, and whether that specific example or some others, this whole discussion that the country seems to be having in this time about cultural appropriation, what do you make of it? How healthy is it? Is it limiting to creating good art? And should we indeed, allow or encourage more license for people to, reinterpret, even if they don't come from those cultures? What are your thoughts here?
Wow. Wow. It's just, it's still just an overwhelming thing, because one of the things that came up for me in your asking of that question, first I was triggered by the notion of, is it healthy? It's just like, wait, especially coming from a background as a fitness professional, like healthy, wait, things that add to your well-being and contribute to your overall sense of purpose and contribution to the world. If you're looking at it from that lens, and no, it's the least healthy thing that could possibly ever happen to a group of people. One of the privileges that we overlook for many people is knowing your story. And many more Europeans and people who are not of the Black experience, which, as we know from an academic perspective, does not just include African Americans. There are many people who lived in the Black experience and understand and connect with Blackness. But we can't identify beyond our great grandparents for many of us. the privilege of knowing your why allows you to move through the world and engage with things and cultures and cultural artifacts and ways of being that, for lack of a better word, entitle you to use them in your experience. But for African Americans, and for myself specifically, because Black people are not a monolith, though we do have some shared understandings within the context of Blackness. Now living as a contributing artist and dancer, there's nothing more hurtful than seeing someone use your art in a way that you did not intend for it to be used. And while the requirements of some ways of moving through the world in order to survive and in order to share and to be contributive in a way that many are telling you that you can't, does position some people in problematic places and result in some problematic uses of the art. I think it's important to really just acknowledge that beneath the art, again, like it are these people's stories. And it's not that it is limiting, it should be limiting for a time, how you engage with these art forms. If you're not well versed in the experiences of these people, if you can't speak to what Sugar Sullivan meant by saying twist versus a swivel, then yeah, you shouldn't be teaching it. But similarly, as I was alluding to, there have been moments where the elders especially took time to impart their knowledge to some people that they thought or felt were trying their best to be good bearers of this art form. And in that context, I like to refer to it as cultural surrogacy, because as we speak about, nothing is pun intended and not intended, nothing is just black and white. And there are lots of intersections and overlaps that we don't intend for or plan for. And we have to be thinking about those things as we talk about how our art and other cultural products have moved through the world. I'm just going to stop there because I'll get really emotional and metaphysical really quickly. So I'll let Gabby contribute.
Gabby, what of this thought, both in terms of dance and just other art forms of cultural appropriation?
Yeah, it's a challenging topic, and LaTasha, I'm so glad. I mean, there's so many powerful things that you just said, and one reminder of, like, it's not, nothing is black and white, and race is an invention. Race is an invention that also gets reinvented. Of course, it's a post-colonial product of categorization, and classism, and of course abject racism, and it gets rewritten into society, refresh. We keep subscribing to the delusion of race, and keep building on it. And so even definitions of what's right and wrong based on race and identity and cultural inheritance at the time, Lindy Hop was just a prevalent social dance of its day, is a little different now, because now it's a historical artifact. But I'll stop and just take one big step back and say that there are lots of different examples that we have of different dances and the way they sit in regards to their heritage and where they're positioned for their growth. Tango would be a counterexample that is really strongly identified that the dance belongs to the country, belongs to the dance, and there is a lot of cultural pride from Argentine society and the Argentine government about tango as belonging to Argentina and to Buenos Aires and the famous neighborhoods and the famous individuals that don't just belong to the dance, they belong to the narrative of what it means to be from that place. Now, myself and LaTasha have told you nothing about how great Lenny Hop is, and what an American thing it is, and what a Black American thing it is, and what a New York thing it is, what a Harlem thing it is, what an East Harlem thing it is. I mean, it belongs to us, but that's because we know a lot about it. And frankly, we do not live in a country that actually takes an enormous amount of pride when it comes to swing. We don't, in fact, the fact of this show, Swing Out, being produced the way it is, having an artistic residency, is a rare event. And that's because social dances like Lindy Hop don't gain a lot of recognition on the national stage in the concert dance world. That's what makes this such a exciting new endeavor. And I'm saying all this to say that there are a lot of ways to remedy the incongruity of like, how does Lindy Hop relate to its past, and how does it represent its past in its present and its future? And part of that fracture about that cultural appropriation would be one example of. It occurs because we just don't have a lot of recognition of the dance or pride or excitement in the general public. If it was associated strongly in the cultural mind's eye as being a Black American art form, then we really wouldn't have to, then every single itemized, like individual teacher wouldn't have to come in with the like Lindy Hop Bill of Rights and introduce it from the get-go. We don't have that, so we have to constantly connect those dots, and some people get it right and some people get it wrong. Some people get it wrong with goodwill in their hearts. Some people get it wrong, feigning nothing but, like lack of responsibility. And so it's inevitable that there will be this scramble for associating parentage, like, oh, it's really a modern thing. Well, I really only learned it from this person. That person was white, so I don't really need to pay heed to its cultural ancestry, is a logical conclusion one might draw, not because it's right, but that's just that person's lived experience. I'm getting a little rambly. I think that there's some cracks in the foundation of how we understand social dancing broadly, and those cracks make for like enormous problems, rifts further down the line. And we, the leaves on the tree, are trying desperately to connect the current day practice of the dance with the source, with respect and honor and appreciation in our hearts. And we will definitely make mistakes, but the intention is what we want to share, both to our students and the value of connecting those dots.
Thank you very much for that answer. And there are some questions queued up in the Zoom chat here. So those of you who have them, we'll get to those in just a moment, but please add to the total if you would like. And of course, we'll take questions from the audience here as well. But I want to quickly turn back to you, LaTasha, in terms of, in using the example, which I thought was quite keen, of the tango and what it means to Argentina. And Gabby was talking about, this dance, being an American and a Black American and a New York and a Harlem and an East Harlem specificity. And this came about at a time, when the Black community was much more cordoned off from the dominant white culture, aware of it, but not nearly as much exposure. We didn't have the technological transformations in the media environment that we have. And so I'm wondering, to what degree does that dynamic actually drive such a unique cultural expression? And to what degree, if at all, does the mainstreaming of so much of our current culture, or the homogenization of it, potentially curtail cultural experimentation?
It's a really beautiful question. It's like you do this for a living or something, John. It's great.
Be a journalist, just got to be curious, I guess.
Well, it's fascinating because it's bringing up for me interesting conversation that I had last night with a good friend of mine and rather famous Lindy Hopper, Nick Williams, in regard to how I think about that personally. And one of the things that comes up for me is space. as you were saying, the Black community being cordoned off and being, for lack of a better word, confined to a particular space, being externally confined to a particular ideal of how they're being viewed, not necessarily a way of looking at themselves for many. Some of them subscribe to it, but some still resist it. And taking that space, and even though I guess you would say still containing it, taking that space and allowing themselves to use it collectively to find ways to express themselves and to share their frustrations, their joys, all of the things that make up a life. And in that, also not allowing the way society was trying to confine them and identify them to define how they express themselves. Using their art, their bodies, their voices subversively, but within their own space. And then seeing the rest of the world see the joy, the power, the passion, and decide to insert themselves into that space. It's just a very challenging thing to sit with, especially as I listen to my elders talk about this. And they talk about it in just a matter of fact way. But of course, having the experience of the hindsight that I do now, about what was happening around them as well, it's like we talk about the Savoy as an integrated ballroom, but is it really integrated when people force you to dance with people that you don't want to dance with? Is that what we call that? I don't know. And in addition, yes, you can have moments of actual sharing, even when you don't want to. I mean, people with siblings know that that's a thing. But to just, I guess, say that it's doing my best not to get emotional, because I care a lot about this, and I don't want people to get lost in the emotionality of what I'm saying. It's really important to continue to acknowledge, as Gabby said, that these spaces, these art forms were created in these confined spaces. They were then invaded further and spread out. And then as the dance forms were able to take up space in the mainstream, once again, space was forced into it for it to be reshaped and put onto Broadway stages. And in the reshaping, those who came in and decided it was a good thing continued to move it beyond its origin point. And in interests of being succinct or brief, I guess, the more they started to reference it, the less they referenced where it came from and who actually created what. And in addition to that, it also started to have an even more patriarchal bent. And the chorus line girls, who were really, really the originators and driving forces of jazz and Lindy Hop, were all overlooked as just beautiful adornments to the thing, as opposed to the powerhouses and production managers and absolute amazing creators that they were. So there's many, many different lenses with which to attack that question. And yeah, I'm gonna leave that open for Gabby. Gabby and I work very well. I kind of open the flower and Gabby picks the petals and produce them appropriately.
For anyone who is watching and listening who is maybe not connected to the Lenny Hop community, I suspect the majority of our audience, LaTasha and I, we both live in New York. We are friends and occasional artistic collaborators, and certainly a conversation like this is just normal topic for a Saturday night for us. So thank you for just giving us space to have this conversation. Yeah, I think just briefly, the dynamics of what like LaTasha described, which is an art form emerges and their needs in a society with an imbalance of power and access to resources. There at times needs to be an incubation period, or at several times needs to be an incubation period where a fledgling art form needs to find its identity and create its own solidarity internally. that might be a time before it's ready to be picked over by the general public. Of course, what happens, just like in the 90s, when you expose in an artistic artifact that is deeply cultural to a mainstream audience, is a whole lot of eyeballs and a whole lot of fusion and a whole lot of good and interesting intersections between that art form and other art forms. And that kind of works into America's big melting pot theory, is like, look at how strong and interesting we are when we combine points of view. But of course, that at times can be anathema to the desire to let that art form find its perspective or speak from a sovereign point of view. This balancing act doesn't need to be so difficult, but it is difficult in the context of injustice, of imbalance between access to having an audience, the ability to make money from the art form that you create that's popular. So it's really these kind of deep rifts in society that lead to these big questions, like, what is cultural appropriation? Why is it cultural appropriation if it's a white person performing hip hop on TV, but not a person making pasta, but not associating that with Italy? And I think that it's a really fruitful conversation that is immensely complex, that really just needs to be looked at against the context of social injustice, because it's a moving target, frankly.
Well, we're going to invite people here in the audience and then certainly people online here. I know we have some online questions queued up, so I'm going to ask if she could, because she has a microphone, if Christian wants to read some of those, and we'll have both of you weigh in on them. Please.
Yes. So the first question I'll ask is from Ilea Stites, and she says, LaTasha, thank you so much for speaking from your particular experience of knowing your story. I'm a tap dancer and very much empathize with how the tools of the dance are sometimes the only ways we have of accessing our ancestors' stories. Could you speak to ways you found that the elders, perhaps dancestors, have passed on these art forms as a tool for cultural resistance and resilience building?
Wow, that's a beautiful, beautiful question. Thank you, Alia. And yeah, it's been a privilege and like mind blowing, but also at the same time upending the lengths that I've had to go to retether myself to my story artistically, dance wise speaking. But it's been worth it, and I'm grateful to have had the privilege to do that. But yes, one of my favorites, of course, is my mentor, Miss Norma Miller. Her absolute uncompromising way of teaching and performing is the most brazen act of resistance I can absolutely think of right now, particularly with, I'm just going to say it, from my perspective, one of the most marginalized groups in the world, the Black woman. And for her to have had as enduring of a career in the entertainment industry, starting from 14 through to 99, is just a statement unto itself. The way that she broke down some of her most famous choreographies, and the way she borrowed from the chorus line dancers because she only borrowed from the best. And the way that she refused to allow mediocrity, even in the general celebration of the art form that she held close to her, I think for me personally was one of the most resistive ways that she existed. One of the things that is problematic and I still find hilarious, and it's just as an educator, because as people love to make the arguments, oh, that's not a real word, well, that's not a real thing, well, that's not a valid resource. It's like, well, what makes it valid? People started using it, people started referencing it, people started qualifying it as such. So it's like, But a lot of the children of many of the elders who are included in the jazz dance book purported by Marshall Stearns have continued to share that many of the things shared are not indeed as true as people may want them to be. So there's subversiveness in having to work with people that they were questioning. I think are some of the most interesting ways that they put forth information, but did so in a resistive way. But one of the things that I will share that they poured into me directly, specifically Chaz Chester, Sugar, and Barbara Billups, was a reinforcement, a galvanization of my desire to show up. It may have started from a place of reactivity to what I understood then as cultural appropriation, but by their guidance and their example, they showed up and danced for them. And the them wasn't just them as an individual, it was for their community, for people to see how they thought about their art, for people to see within their individual expression how powerful the Black understanding of this dance form could be. And it wasn't to upend or overshadow anybody, because it was beyond that now. And one of the most beautiful things, one of the most beautiful gifts that they gave me was this understanding of, yeah, I can do the kitschy thing. I don't want to, but because I understand the power of who I am, I understand the power of my expression and how this thing is going to move through the world and how that can allow space for others to move and express. Okay, I'll do this. I'll be a part of this to make sure that it continues to move forward in the way that it needs to. And that's a challenging thing for people who have not yet contended with themselves to understand, especially when they see it from the outside. So that's, Gabby knows that that's a question I often retort to people who ask, like, oh, well, why are you continuing to share outside of this community? And like, I'm so tired of seeing other people do Black art. And my question is, do you swing out though? Are you even participating? Like, I get it, and that's a valid understanding, but maybe show up and then contribute and help do the thing. And that's the most beautiful thing that I took from the elders.
Thank you for sharing that. And we're going to go to another question here, please.
We have great questions in the Q&A. The next one I'll ask is an anonymous question that has some context. From its birth, the Lindy Hop grew and developed over time. This will have happened in an organic matter, informed by but not constrained by its roots. Can the Lindy Hop continue to develop as a dance without drifting from its roots? And is it possible to respect the roots while continuing to develop?
Indeed, a great question. Gabby, how about if we turn to you and get your perspective on that, please?
Yeah, it is a great question. And I think that it's a question that everyone who participates in the dance, who seeks to teach it, perform it, produce it, should ask themselves. It's not a static answer. It will change over the course of one's experience with the dance. There will be years of your teaching life where you're like, oh no, like it is like such a complete art form. It should never be innovated. I'm going to do that. And then, 2 years later, you'll go through and you're like, no, it needs to belong to the world and I'm going to make it modern. And, like the idea that there's a singular answer is something that suits this context right now. But the truth is that it's your roommate. You live with Lenny Hop if you choose to let it be in your life. So that's an answer that you'll answer in different ways over time. If that sounds like a dodge, that's fair. I do have a thought, which is that there are different ways. I mean, if you're going to use the word Lindy Hop, if you're going to use that technical word that it refers to a specific event in time, then there are styles of music, styles of movement, specific artists, and specific clips that you should watch to know that that thing that you say you do is the thing you're doing. You might also associate this with, and I will get so far out of my depth if I go too far with this, but ballet. There are, of course, contemporary ballet creators and choreographers and many iterations of what ballet means over time, but every ballet class is going to start with a plie combination and tendus and port de bras. So Lenny Hop has the same basis. It has the same core language. When dancers are interested in the aesthetics of Lenny Hop and one component of it, and they want to perform that component of it integrated with other forms of movement to other styles of dance, I say mazel tov. I say have a great time being a dancer. This is part of the language of movement. But if it strays really far away from that core language of the steps that define it, the rhythms that define it, the music that defines it, you can say it's swing inspired, but I think the technical language of Lindy Hop or even swing dancing becomes an improper title for something like that. And I'll also say, I mean, I guess what I'm talking about is the dance and the music that it comes from. The spirit of the dance too has of course a lot to do with what the thing is. Lindy Hop is a dance that is about itself. Lindy Hop is a dance where the steps that have names that are associated with people, they named it after the circumstances they were in, being in dance halls, listening to jazz musicians, making animal-like or eccentric movement in the context of showing physical movement to other dancers or to an audience. It's very self-referential. In that sense, again, it's important to understand the dance as you innovate. Innovation is inevitable. It's easier to innovate than to recreate, and I think the titles get worked out in different ways in different people's minds. But in my mind, the intention, the steps, and the vocabulary and the music are the things that do make it Lindy Hop. That doesn't mean that young dancers can't create their own versions of those rhythms and steps, but straying just kind of makes it something else, which is
LaTasha,
not a bad thing.
thank you. And LaTasha, I see you nodding if you want to add to this. And when you add to it, just a quick question as well. You've really shared a lot, which we appreciate, about talking to the elders and getting a sense of, the reason and the why the structure exists. Is there also, some great film or art? Because, of course, this came with the rise of the film industry as well. And it was a lot of it captured, or some of it captured that way. And has that helped you, both academically as well as from a dance perspective, really understand it?
Wow. Yeah, what I had just co-signing what Gabby was saying. Yes, all of the things. Um, it's it's really fascinating because my journey was, as Gabby and I were talking about, more top down. I was coming from the offshoots, or one of the sired forms of expression that have come from the being in jazz. From house dance, hip hop culture. Sorry about that. Street dance culture. And I did see the film, and of course, the first that I encountered in my adult recollection was the Big Apple from Keep Punching. And interestingly, because of the way swing had been packaged to me at that time, I was like, oh, here's some imagery of Black dancers doing the dance, not the creators and innovators of the dance. And it's important to recognize that most of the footage that we have are of the second/third generation of dancers doing Lindy Hop. But there are great film references. There are great dance moments that are captured. And the favorites, are Hell's a Poppin', A Day at the Races, and things like this. But even while we regard those recordings of these dance moments as spectacularly as we do, we also still have to pay attention to the underlying context that some of these artists were forced to exist in and perform in, that are not serving of the dance. They are just actually, sadly, the presentation of the social ordering and frustrations of the time, I guess would say, to put it gently. But from my perspective personally, I was not a clip dissector. We have many of those in the community, and they nerd out about like the exact time as things were happening in certain particular shapes to try to achieve the shapes and things like that. I wanted to approach it from the lived aspect of it. I wanted to understand the movement, and I aim to have anyone that I'm in concert with as a teacher or as a dancer or a collaborator live in that same space with me in order for us to be able to communicate and create together, and to try to bring the power and the amazingness of the expression as the elders intended it forward into today, even with some modernized aspects. But I very much agree with what Gabby said, and I hope people heard that clearly. The more you stray from the thing as when it was named and most celebrated, you're doing something different. And it is important to name it as such. And it seems to be only problematic when it's about Black art forms. I'm just going to put it out there. Hip hop danced by ballerinas to hip hop music is not, and then ballet uniform is not hip hop. That's not what that is. It can be inspired by, but it's not hip hop. And there's nothing wrong with putting social dances on stage. Yes, it does lose a little bit of its natural element and fire, but it still can and should be celebrated in those spaces, because it is from the social structure that we've gotten all of these things that are performative now. And one of my favorite works, Babylon Girls by Jana Brown, speaks to how the chorus line dancers and I call them chorus line dancers just to be succinct, but they were dancing amongst themselves even before they were put on stage with the bands and things like this. But they really shaped this modern expression that we have about theater and performance. And we really need to take more time to regard that history as we continue to try to build this artistic capital D dance world.
I just want to like underscore something that LaTasha said that I just so much agree with, and is just such a great insight that I hadn't thought of in this particular order, which is what are the dance forms that that audiences feel like they have the right to override, and which dances don't people feel like they have the dances to override. We might look at the special shoe oriented dances like ballet and tap dancing. If you have a special shoe, people feel afraid to say that you're doing those things unless you're wearing that special shoe. I'm being a little cute about it, but really it's obviously excluding tap for a moment, it's obviously a mirror reflection of power. It's obviously a mirror reflection of which dances have cultural institutional support and which dances are for our cute hobbies that are important, that remain important markers in American dance innovation, yet have very few opportunities for public recognition. And I think that when you follow that contour, then you will find the dances through which people feel like they easily say, "Oh, I'm referring to Lindy Hop. I'm referring to that," without any sense of recourse, without any sense of like, "Well, why did you use that word?" or "How would you associate the thing you did with the dance you're referencing?" When the barrier to prove some association with ballet is much higher in people's imagination because of that impression we have. We have such a strong impression. Shoes aside.
Let's go to another question from someone on Zoom, please.
Sure. How do you feel about this show, about this Black vernacular dance, the fact that it's finally being shown through a cultural institution like the Joyce for what at least seems to be the first time through Caleb Teicher and Company and not through a Lindy Hop performance group? Is there a sense of white gatekeeping or discomfort surrounding how the dance gets its representation on the concert stage?
LaTasha, you want to address that?
Sure. I'm glad I had the question open and could read it, because for some reason, Kristen's mic is not broadcasting as loudly as it was before. But I'll get into the question. In short, yes, there is some white gatekeeping abound with this. However, not in the nefarious way that I think many may think. Caleb comes from a very strong Lindy Hop background. He's been celebrating this dance actually longer than I have as an educator of it. And well, granted, my great grandmother swung me out when I was 4, but I really didn't understand the context of that. You know, it was a different thing. But one of the things for me that, and thank you again, whoever asked this question, for asking this question. One of the things for me that comes up is my ultimate goal, and that is subversion. Because of the many identities that we've been forced into and many of the constructs that we're forced to navigate, it was really humbling to me first for Caleb to ask me to be a part of the Brain Trust for developing this. And one of the things that I said unabashedly when we first got into the room, and I know my friends know and love me, and I know they know it was coming either way. I was like, this production needs to represent the root of this dance form. I will not be the only Black dancer on stage. It's not gonna happen. If that's what's gonna happen, then I'm out. And gratefully, they all agreed as well. And it wasn't just a matter of putting Black dancers on stage for the sake of putting Black dancers on stage. We wanted to put a representation of dancers from all aspects of the community. However, we wanted to also ensure that we did represent this dance in the best way possible, recognizing that it has existed in a Broadway capacity and that it does exist in a performative and competitive capacity. And it is at its core a social dance, but all of those people, all of those different identities within the thing exist and make up the community and how we share and express with each other. It's always the most beautiful thing when you're at a social dance, or when we used to be at a social dance, and you would get some of the big time performers or the teachers for that weekend throw down in the middle of the circle with people who just learned a rock step a half hour ago. It's amazing. That's the thing. It's the beauty of it. And for the Joyce to be as excited about Caleb's excitement about this community and this art form as they are, was one of the things that dissuaded that discomfort, or assuaged that discomfort, sorry. Because, you know, Caleb will tell you point blank, when he asked me, I was like, why? What do you mean? I don't understand. But it is important, as Gabby was alluding to earlier, for it to be, even though you're right, there is the gatekeeping. I feel like the Joyce, again, is subverting the norms with this and putting this inherently Black social dance form that has empowered a community of people to share and express themselves, and giving it its due, giving social cultural dance its due. And that is amazing.
Well, thank you for that. Kristen has a new microphone, so hopefully you can hear. If not, I'll translate. But let's go to another question because we have several queued up here, please.
So we have another anonymous attendee. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Good. Okay. Who says, thank you both for this discussion. I'm very new to the dance and culture behind Lindy Hop. When trying to do a little research on it, I came up across many different terms such as solo jazz, authentic jazz, vernacular jazz, Lindy Hop, and swing dance. So two-part question. Number one, how should these terms be distinguished from one another? And number two, from your experience, what's the best approach for learning more and more about the culture in dance, especially for people who are very new to this and are coming from communities with little or no experts on the art form?
Gabby, any thoughts on that one?
This is the age-old question, and gosh, I have even more words to confuse you with, like East Coast swing and jitterbug, and the different subsets of dances that came from the swing era, like Balboa and shag. You're right. I validate your confusion, because there are a lot of terms, and that's a byproduct of it being a folk art form, which took on many different names in different regions of the country as it became popular, before there was easy access to mass communication, like social media. It's also worth saying that we currently live in a time where the main the main object that we are giving each other in the current Lindy Day community is classes. And classes are subject, of course, to marketing, and marketing invents all kinds of language. So if you hear a term like solo jazz or vernacular jazz or Charleston class, they will mean different things to different people based on whatever regional, assumption works with that word. All I'm doing is just saying, not only are you right in being confused, but it gets even more confusing. The answer to the question is that there's a style of music called swing that is a subset of jazz, and the style of movement that grew up alongside it is Lindy Hop. And when we think of swing, it's really a rhythm aspect of the music itself. So when someone says swing dance, they're defining a kind of dance that's done to swing music. And this might be a little more evident in another dance form called salsa, where you might have a salsa dance and a salsa rhythm and a salsa band, and they're all one and the same. Am I getting even more confusing? Yes. So the targeted answer to your question is to Google the name of your city and the word Lindy Hop, and hopefully a website will come up, or a Facebook group perhaps, pointing you to a local manifestation of this community. Lenny Hop is incredibly successful as a global phenomena because it is a democratic art form. It is not a dance form where teachers actually need to be validated by a board. They do not need to have won a certain number of competitions. Many people teach and share the dance with just a few years experience, and that happens in large towns, in small towns, in really teeny tiny towns. I for a long time had an ongoing conversation about teaching in Darwin, Australia, which is a very, very small town, very, very far away from Harlem. So I promise you that even though you may have the impression that there isn't swing dance where you live, I offer that there might be. And starting with the word Lindy Hop might point you to the most credible sources of this dance and being taught in the context to its history. If not that, then the word swing dance might offer you the same kind of results, but they also might point you to a ballroom studio, which is another conversation for another day. The short answer is they might not point you to the most historical form of the dance. Solo jazz, vernacular jazz, and Charleston are all individual forms of the dance, and again, is just marketing terminology to get you to learn how to dance to swing music without a partner.
One of the things that I'll tack on to that as well, in your listing of all the jazzes, from yet again another subversive standpoint, in academia, one of the things that many Black educators are striving for is proper nomenclature. If we're going to subscribe to a nomenclature, we should do it in proper chronological order. So in that instance, this jazz that we're talking about that is inside or within the Lindy Hop, jazz being the individual expression that contributes to your ability to dance as a partner. Yeah, that is jazz. That is jazz dance. All this other things that happen in studios with undulations and extensions and all of these great things is beautiful and wonderful. It is not jazz dance as it should be termed. It is Fosse, it is Dunham, it is all of these other iterations of jazz expressions and should be named and referenced as such. Authentic jazz, however, is a style of jazz that was sired mostly by Pepsi Bethel. This was something that he put forth as a way of moving, and it was something that was meant to speak to, again, what we keep saying, a sense of self-regard and purpose in your movement, to articulate that through intentional movement. So that's just a little more dynamics, a little more words to confuse you. But if you're going to talk about jazz, and you don't have to do it in an authoritative or mean-spirited way, but make sure that you open up the conversation when you're talking about that for people to understand that you're talking about original jazz. Yes, we call it solo jazz and vernacular jazz or solo Charleston and things like this in a packaged competitive form sometimes, but it is jazz. That is the thing.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and as Christian alluded to before, it would be great to end with the video when people can hear all the audio and see the dance again. But let's get at least to one more question, maybe perhaps two, and we'll see what people are curious about. So please, Christian.
Yeah, this is a question that is kind of a follow-up on the solo jazz thread that you just kind of picked up. COVID is making it difficult or impossible to dance with partners. From conversations with people, there is a barrier from transitioning from partner dancing to solo dancing to jazz music. How important do you think it is for people to be able to dance solo to jazz music? And if the aim is to tell your own truth and encapsulate your own story, should being able to dance solo be promoted as more important through classes and events?
I'm going to start with this because I feel like LaTasha has a really potent answer to this question, and I strategically don't want to follow up. I will say that, I mean, the question kind of answers itself, doesn't it? I mean, the question posits, should we be doing this appealing and interesting thing? Yes, yes, absolutely. You know, something worth saying that may not be evident to the audience here who either is related to the Lenny Hop community or is new to all of this information. Through the 50s to present time, there has always been a very strong association of dance teachers that commercialize what they do, starting with Arthur Murray to present day, to an Arthur Murray studio near you. That really in its origin, we might call it ballroom, and is really fascinated and fixated on partnering and the dynamics between traditionally, historically, men as leaders and women as followers, and the dynamics that play out physically to play out those roles. And Lindy Hop, in the contemporary context, has for many years tracked in the same streams as this well-established casual ballroom community. And during that time, it absorbed a lot of those intense priorities of leading and following, and how you can be a good leader and how you can be a good follower. And the originators of this dance were good leaders and were good followers. But I think that certain aspects of the fetishization of leading and following really belong to that overlap between when ballroom was popular and when swing came back into vogue for a mass audience in the 90s, around the time of that Gap ad. So why is it that we need even to think about partner dancing and solo dancing in separate contexts? Because we are trying to remedy this moment in time when teaching the dance was so disproportionately about leading and following. If we were to draw the dance back to its roots, if we are to watch actual footage of dancers at the Savoy dancing, the separation between dancing alone and dancing with a partner is just not particularly pronounced. We might say that to be a good Lenny Hopper in the context of this original footage, one simply had to be a capable mover individually, and the partner dancing might even feel like a secondary aspect. Of course, people were partner dancing. But I hope you see what I'm saying is that the current paradigm that we have is a byproduct of something that didn't have to happen, which is the infusion of ballroom priorities. So, do I think you should dance alone? Yes. Do I think you should dance alone because COVID is keeping us from dancing with each other safely? Yes. And will it ultimately enrich your relationship with the dance? Should you choose to learn to lead and follow in a partnered context? Of course, it'd make your life better. You'd sleep better at night, have a better breakfast in the morning. I can't underscore how great of a thing it is.
Well, that's a great way to end it, and we're going to show this video in a minute, but I thought I would take this opportunity to thank both of you so much for taking the time, for sharing your experience and your expertise and your passion, which is something that this whole program and the university that is fostering this series is all about. So LaTasha Barnes and Gabby Cook, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. And let's head out on a really positive, upbeat note. And we'll watch this video again and with the audio. Thank you, everyone.